Okay, so I have the templates printed out that I'm going to use when I do the direct cutting, and there's a couple different pages here. This thing, I'll explain this more, but I call this the foil checker. So this basically you can use as you're shaping the fin to check to see how accurate your foil is. This is a really handy thing. You can put this on top of foam and cut it out of foam, and then you'll have sort of like a tool that you can use to double check your foiling as you're going. And then I have, this is the template that will go on the main center piece of foam. So that's the full size of the fin, which you can see this will match right up with that. So that's sort of like your final shape. And then this one, you can see it's kind of like coming in on the back. This is the smaller piece of foam that will go on either side of the first piece of foam. And then the other two, this one that's getting even smaller will be scored into the foam. I use that same Cricut tool to do the scoring because it sinks into the foam maybe a millimeter, which is where that layer is designed to be at that right spot at 1 millimeter down into the foam. But you could also, I'll show you how to do it with an X-Acto knife too. You can also set the X-Acto knife up to score the right amount also. And then this is just traced onto the surface of the foam, and it's just a guide. The one that you trace on and the one that you score into the foam are just guides as you're sanding. You can sort of keep your eye on those and know that you're getting the foiling correct. And then, all of this makes that foiling process much easier than doing it, than creating just a blank shape and trying to eyeball the foiling, which is what the pros do. But this is just, it takes some of the guesswork out of the foiling, and also takes the actual work out, because if you have that blank, so much of the sanding you're doing is just removing material, and we're removing material right off the bat. So by the time you're getting to sanding, you're just shaping more than you're removing just tons and tons of material, which gets time consuming, and which is why they use orbital sanders and power sanders, is because to do it by hand would take forever, but this is designed to go quicker. Okay, so the foam. So this is a piece of the foam core board that this came from Michael's. This is the black stuff that the paper comes off of pretty easily. Most of the times I've done this, it comes off like literally, you just start it and the whole thing comes off in one pull on both sides. For some reason, I think I got a batch that is a little bit stickier, so it's been a little bit harder to work with, but we'll see how it goes. That took maybe 10 minutes. It was a little brutal. Usually it takes like 2 minutes. I don't know what the deal was. So hopefully you guys have an easier time. But now that we have our piece of foam with no paper on it for the most part, I'll start to cut. Now, just to note, this foam has like a grain to it. So you can see that it sort of bends easily in one direction, and in the other direction it's a little bit stiffer. What I do is I make the fin, you can see the grain. It looks a little like wood grain. I make it flexible, like I do it like this, so that the fin flexes sort of from side to side, but not from top to bottom. So I angle the grain to go up and down the fin, so that if there is any flex, it's sort of in this part of the fin and not like perpendicular to the board. I want that to be sturdier. But you can definitely play with that and see which direction you like, but I'm gonna do it that way. So I'll show you how I cut the foam using the Cricut method first, and then I'll do the direct cut. So the Cricut method, I have my old templates over here that I used for my last one. So I'll do the main foil of the fin using the Cricut method, and then maybe I'll do one of the other panels that way too, and then I'll do the third panel cutting it out directly, so you can see how this works. All right, so there it is. It's that easy. It just glides right along and puts a score. You can see the score all along those two shapes. It isn't perfect. There's like, you can see it catches a little bit. It catches more on the white foam than it does the black foam. The black foam cuts more easily. And the Divinycell, the really nice foam that you can order on the internet, that doesn't catch at all. It just glides right over the surface and doesn't catch at all. It's great. But it doesn't matter, because you're going to be sanding it anyway, and it's just not going to be really a problem. It doesn't have to be perfect. The sanding will take out any imperfections. So at this point, you can just sort of bend and snap these shapes out. You can see that came out pretty good. It's a little rough. Like I said, that doesn't really matter as long as you don't have any giant gashes. That's going to stand out just fine. But you can see if I take my ready-made fin, there it is. It's the exact same template. Lines up perfectly. So that's the first piece. There's the second piece. You can see that. It's not perfect, like I said, but it doesn't matter. Piece number two. So you can see that when you match the base based on the shape of the base doesn't change from piece to piece. The base always is the same template, but you can see that this, try to give you a better picture of this. So this second piece of foam is smaller than the first, and is starting to get the shape of the foil in the overall fin as well. So now I'll cut the same piece for the other side. So I save the larger pieces of foam. I can maybe use them for another fin in the future. This is a piece that I used for the last fin that I made. It looks like it actually still has some paper on the other side. I'll cut it out and then I'll take that paper off as well. So to cut this out, again, I want to make sure I'm cutting kind of with the grain going the right direction. So I'm going to lay this on to my piece of foam. Oh, broke. You can see there at the back. I accidentally cracked the base, but I'm actually not going to worry about that. I'm going to put a little glue in that crack and just leave it, because the foam really doesn't provide any strength to the fin at all. It's the epoxy and the fiberglass that makes it strong. The fin just kind of bulks it up to get it to the right thickness. So I can just put a little glue in that and that'll be fine. So there's my 3 foam pieces. I'm going to hang on to this little piece that fell off and I'll glue that on, but you can at least see how these all fit together. If you line the bases up, that's basically going to be the shape of your fin, and you're going to, you know, sand down the edges and smooth this all out, but that's all the pieces you need. So the next step is to trace the other shapes onto here. Do the scoring layer and the layer with that you trace onto the surface. I'll do the tracing layer first. I'm going to use my cardboard templates that I cut out, but you can use the printouts to do that, or however you want to do it. This is the template that I made for the last fin. So I'm just going to take the first, this side, and make sure it's the side that's going to be facing up, and I'll line up the smallest stencil or template. That's on the one side, and then you want to do the same thing on this side. So trace that on. And then I have to do the scoring layer. And like I said, what the scored line does is, just as you're removing material, as you're removing foam and you're sanding, you'll see that line that's scored into the foam, but as you're sanding, that line should disappear. So if you're seeing that line on the surface and you're sanding, you know you have more sanding to do. So it just helps as a guide. I'll do, for the one side, I will do it using the Cricut blade. So there you can see that line that's scored into the surface now, and you'll watch that disappear as you start sanding. So I want to do the same thing on this side, and I'll do this with an X-Acto knife to show you how that would work. I have this little guy, which is I believe it's a caliper. I got this for maybe like $10 at a hardware store, and it's really good for measuring the thickness of things down to the millimeter, which is helpful with this. You don't need it, but I use it. You can, use it to measure. You can see the Cricut blade sticks out about 1 millimeter. About 1 millimeter from the housing, so that's how far it's going down into the foam. And I'm just going to kind of do that on my blade so that I know it's cutting in the same depth as the Cricut blade. So I'll just line it up, and now that is sticking out. It's a little hard to see, but it's sticking out 1 millimeter beyond the tape. So I can just grab my paper template, and of course it's flipped around the wrong way, but that's okay, I can still see it. So I'll just make sure this is lined up. All right, there that is. You can see the line is scored in. Try to show you that line. It's a little hard to see, but there is a scored line the whole way around, so that will help when sanding. So at this point, this is ready to be fiberglassed and laminated together. So I'll show you how that works. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna do is cut the pieces of fiberglass. I'm gonna do 6 pieces of fiberglass. So fiberglass cloth, so 3 layers for each of these panels. So we're gonna glue fiberglass, epoxy fiberglass on the 2 outer layers, let it cure a little bit, trim off the excess, and then laminate it to the main piece. One thing that I do on the main centerpiece of foam to make it easier when it comes time to glue or to laminate together is I do another tracing where I trace the shape of the outer layer onto the main layer on both sides, so I know where to spread the glue. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do that. And then it's traced on both sides, so we'll apply the glue inside of that line. Another thing that is really helpful to do is actually to put a center line, a really thin line on the edge of the center piece, so that as you're sanding, you know where the absolute center of this thick piece of foam is. When you get sanding, you can kind of lose track of where the exact center, the precise center of this piece of foam is. So I'll show you how to do that too. If you put one of the layers, you can do it on either side. So I'll put one of the outer layers on and just lay this flat on the table. And then if you take the Sharpie without the cap on and lay it flat, it's right about at the right height that it will mark the center of this piece of foam, and I'll sort of show you how to do this. So here's the Sharpie, it's just laid flat on the table, and I have, again, this is on top of this piece of foam, and you just lay it flat, make sure it's pressed down, and just guide it right along. And you do that on both sides and around the tip. It actually did a better job on the back, on the trailing edge, on the front edge. It's a little bit off, but either way, you can use it to keep an eye on it and just kind of know where you are. I might actually try to do that one again on the front edge, on the leading edge, so it's more accurate. Yeah, that's better. Now it's more right in the center, and I can keep an eye on that while I'm sanding. So now we'll cut out the pieces of fiberglass. So the fiberglass is going to go on the back side of the two smaller panels. And you can either use a scissors to cut the fiberglass. I find it easier to use a roller, like one of these rollers. You can get these at any craft store. I'm not sure how much they cost. My wife had this from you know, doing stuff with fabric, but it cuts the fiberglass really nicely and doesn't make a big mess. So I use that just to zip along. The shapes that you cut out can be really crude, and actually I'm gonna go wash my hands because they're dirty, and I don't want to get the fiberglass cloth dirty. It doesn't matter as much for the inside as it does the outside, but since I'm using the same piece of fiberglass cloth for the outside and the inside, I don't want to get the fiberglass cloth dirty, because it will you'll get like fingerprints on the outside, and the nice color and finish that you do on the outside will get kind of dirty from your hands. So make sure to wash your hands up or wear gloves. Okay, I'm back. Hands are clean. This is how you cut the fiberglass. I'm just gonna also just make sure there's not really any foam dust on my working surface. By the way, this surface that I'm working on is a silicone mat, a silicone cutting mat, which is really good for working with epoxy. If the epoxy, I mean, you can, when the resin is wet, you can just wipe it off with alcohol. The alcohol won't screw up the silicone. Acetone will, so be careful with acetone on this surface. Also, when the epoxy dries, you can just pick it up, you know, scratch it off with your finger, or use tape or a blade to get it off. It just, you want to be careful. You don't want to like do epoxy on a surface that you're really worried about, and for some reason the epoxy doesn't really stick to silicone, so it's nice to have one of these cutting mats. You can use parchment paper or wax paper. I have some of that back here. I buy this and these pieces of parchment paper. You can do epoxy and fiberglassing on top of this if you have like a wooden surface or something and you don't want to get epoxy on it. Epoxy will not stick to this parchment paper, so that's really nice as well. Okay, so for the cutting, here's your piece of fiberglass cloth. Eventually I'm going to get a bolt of fiberglass cloth that is like on a roll, which would be nicer because when it's folded, you kind of get an uneven surface. You can see there's sort of areas where the fiberglass is kind of coming apart a little bit. That doesn't really matter for the structural integrity or even the look of the fin. You won't see that. It's probably better not to have it, but you know, if you get a larger roll where it's never been folded, you won't have that happen. It's not a big deal, but I think I will eventually start getting rolls of fiberglass cloth, and that's not going to be an issue. But sometimes I kind of work the cloth a little bit to close those gaps. Like I said, you don't have to, but it's not a terrible thing to do. Fiberglass cloth is a little tricky to work with. As you can see, it kind of like frays really easily. And so as soon as you cut it, it starts fraying. So what I do, I try to cut as close in time to when I'm using it and applying and wetting it out with epoxy. I try to cut as close to that as possible, and Don't move it around a whole lot because it will start to fray around the edges, which isn't a huge deal because we're going to be cutting them larger than the piece of foam. And so even if it frays around the edges, it's not, you're going to get a clean cut anyway with the method that I'm going to show you for cutting it and getting it like to the perfect size of the foam. But it just creates a mess. The more it frays apart, the more of a mess you get, which, you know, just is what it is. So I'm going to use just one of my outside fin templates and just start cutting pieces out. So again, I'm going to do 6 pieces, 3 for each panel. And you just take your rotary tool or your scissors, and this does not have to be perfect. So that's the first piece. It's just a really crude shape of the fin. I'm going to set that aside and keep going. So that's one. You can really do this in any direction. I try to do it in a way where I'm maximizing the amount, or actually minimizing the amount of scrap. The scrap you can use to do other things, but it's best to get them as close together as you can right off the bat. It just makes for less, you know, less scrap, and you can potentially get more fins out in the long run. I'd say you want to keep maybe 1.5 to 2 inches of fiberglass cloth beyond the perimeter of the piece of foam. Maybe like 1 inch minimum. I'm going to take this excess larger sheet and just put that away because I don't need it until later. And the last piece. So like I said, I'm doing 6 layers of fiberglass on the inside of the fin. You can do more if you want to. You can go to 4 layers. You can go to, so that's 3 layers on each side. You can do 4 layers on each side, which would give you 8 total, or you can even go to, you know, 5 layers on each side and 10. It doesn't add that much thickness to the overall fin. It takes, I think, like at least 5 or 6, 7, maybe 8 layers of fiberglass cloth and epoxy to get a millimeter. So you can experiment with adding more if you want more strength. Also, I think you would potentially need that on some of the larger fins, like 9, 9.5, 10. On some of the smaller fins where there's less pressure on the fin, like the fin is just, there's less water moving over it. Or if you're a lighter surfer, I'm a 220-pound surfer, so I'm putting a lot of pressure on the fin because of my body weight. So I need it to be pretty strong. If you're doing one of the smaller sizes, you're a smaller person, you can get away with less fiberglass cloth. You might be able to do like 2 layers per side on the inside and get away with 4 total layers on the inside. That goes for the outside as well. You can add or remove, I'd say a minimum of 1 or 2 layers on the outside on each side, but you can add more. The disadvantage with adding more is, like, if you're adding more on the inside and on the outside, you're bulking up the width of the fin a little bit. And on the outside, as you're adding layers of fiberglass cloth, it sort of mutes the color. I mean, it's just a visual thing, but it could, if you have, you know, like bright colors, if you had 3, 4 layers on each side, it's gonna gray back your color. The one that I made, this has just like 2 layers. It was brighter before I put the fiberglass cloth on, but I'm still happy with it. It's a nice effect overall. So I think it looks good with 2 layers. So I'm gonna do the same thing on this one. I'm gonna do 6 on the inside and 4 on the outside, so 10 layers total. So that's cutting out the cloth. The next thing I'm gonna do is glue or mix up some epoxy and get that glued onto these pieces of foam. All right, so I have everything cut out and ready to go. I'm ready to start epoxying and applying the fiberglass cloth to both of the 2 pieces. So I'm gonna do that, glue those up, and I have all my tools ready. I have to mix up some epoxy. I'm gonna be using the BSI Slow Cure 30-minute, and I'm gonna try to keep track of how much I'm using so I can say definitively how much epoxy it takes. I use just a basic scale to measure, to weigh the amount of epoxy I'm using. I think you could also maybe, just do it if you had a container that had sort of measurement on the sides of the container. You could maybe do it that way, but I want the accuracy of knowing, I'm using exactly a 1-to-1 mix of the resin and the hardener. So I use just a pretty cheap scale. 12 grams of resin, and then I'll do 12 of the hardener, and then just mix it for a minute. So what I usually like to do is just put a thin coat all over the inside of the foam, and then lay the fiberglass on, and then pour more on top to get the rest of the way through. So you'll start to see the fiberglass cloth becoming translucent as the epoxy soaks through all 3 layers. That's what you want. You want to see that everywhere. So, spread it, move it around. It'll take some time for, especially this epoxy, because it's so thick, to soak through and do that. You also want to make sure you're kind of like wetting the epoxy, or wetting the fiberglass out beyond where the foam is, because that's going to be what makes it get a little bit harder and easier to cut with a razor blade once we get to that point. So don't worry about slopping it too much outside of the perimeter of the fin. You actually want that to happen. The other thing that I'll do sometimes too is I have a heat gun. I think you could use a hairdryer too. With this thicker epoxy, sometimes hitting it with heat will sort of make it a little bit runnier again for a little while, and it helps it kind of soak through all the layers. So sometimes if I see that this is not getting translucent enough, I might hit it with some heat just to help the epoxy soak through and get a little easier to work with again. You can kind of extend the amount of time you have. This says it's a 30-minute epoxy. I feel like it goes off faster than that. It just starts to get thick pretty quickly. I don't know exactly what to attribute that to, but it's not the easiest epoxy to work with, but it's easy to get at the store, which is why I'm using it. So, and you can buy it in smaller quantities. the pressure that you use too, of just sort of working the epoxy, also helps it seep through the layers. So don't be shy about kind of trying to push it and work it back and forth over the surface. That just helps sort of squeegee it through. So you're just kind of moving it around the entire surface, kind of pressing it in and pressing it through the layers, and moving it from areas where you have a lot built up to areas on the cloth where you sort of need some more to soak through. And at this point, this is starting to get thicker, so I think I'm gonna use a little heat. Just set this somewhere else to dry, to cure for a little bit, somewhere flat. So I might actually use a little bit more. I think that was enough epoxy, but because it's thicker, it's a little harder to work with. I'd like to have a little bit more there. So I might go to, I did 12 grams of hardener and 12 grams of resin, but I might go up to like 13 or 14. All right, so at this point, both of these panels are, they've cured a little bit, but not so much that the epoxy is hardened. It's sort of stiffening up, and that's the point you want to be at to cut off the excess fiberglass cloth from both pieces. And that's also the point you want to be at to laminate. So while it still sort of has a little bit of tack to it, I remove the excess and then glue it together. So I'm going to try to bang that out here real quick. It's a brand new razor blade. I find new works the best. I use them a couple times, but they can get a little gummed up if you do this a little prematurely. So you can clean them off and use them, but a new one just, it's the easiest. And there's the second piece. So now I'm gonna mix up some more epoxy, apply it to the main fin on one side, do that, and then flip it over and do the other side. I'm just trying to keep it inside of these lines. It just helps when sanding to not have epoxy, to have to sand through a bunch of epoxy. If you can, if you're mostly sanding through foam, it's really going to help you in terms of the speed. So then just using the base as a guide, you can just line that up. Just double check to make sure you're within that line that you drew on the surface. Looks like that's pretty evenly spread on that side, so you can go ahead and apply this layer. Lining up the base, checking to make sure it's within the template line. Looks pretty good. I'll check this side again. You have a little bit of time while it's setting up to shift it around if you need to, but once it starts really setting up, it's, you know, it's impossible to move. So you want to make sure you get it really in the right spot. And then the other thing I'm going to do, because I have a little bit of epoxy left and some time, I'm going to just try to run a layer of epoxy right along this trailing edge, because as you're filing, as you're sanding this down, this edge gets very thin and you can kind of tear that edge up. Right now it's about 4 millimeters, but you're going to be getting it down to maybe like 1 millimeter, and that edge can really, you can run into trouble. So you can also repair it if you do nick it. There's a pretty easy way that I can show you to repair it, which if I nick it, I'll show you how that works. But just to prevent that as much as possible, I'm gonna just try to do like this and spread. There you go, that should be pretty good. So now what I'll do is get a relatively clean piece of parchment paper and double check to make sure nothing slid around on me as far as the laminated layers. Looks like that might have shifted a little bit, so I can still have a little bit of time here that I can move this around and make sure everything's aligned. The sanding will also help with giving you a perfect perimeter, so don't worry too much about having it absolutely aligned, but the best you can do at this point, it'll help you in the long run. So that looks pretty good. What I do then is I'll cover it with parchment paper and then put a heavy book on it. 30,000 years of art. This thing is heavy. It's probably about 10 pounds maybe, so that does a real nice job, and it basically fits the entire fin. Yeah, so I can just let that sit for maybe as long as you want it. It can dry overnight, or you might be able to come back in an hour or 2 or 3 and do the sanding. I'm just gonna let it sit for now and I'll come back later and sand.